Before we get to questions, Fred, you said you finally found what you've been looking for.
I did.
What is it?
We have been talking about pine sawfly on primarily Scotch pine since the very first show. And I kept saying, they're coming. And then Jim said, they're coming. And then I said, they're coming. Well, they're finally here, about a month late. So it's been really cold. So what I look for on my Scotch pine, first of all, I look for these little brown needles right at the very tip, and there's a lot of brown needles out there. And because when the larvae first hatch, they feed on the surface of the needles, and they cause this little very distinctive shriveling type of thing. And then if we look down in here, you can actually see hopefully you can see them, yeah, you can see the larvae quite nicely. They're about a 1/4 of an inch long, so they're very small. So now would be the time that we'd want to be treating those things. Once they get much bigger, there'll be a lot of defoliation. So again, because they aren't a caterpillar, this is a primitive wasp, they're very susceptible to almost anything you can put on them. So something like 7 works very well. Permethrin would work well. An insecticidal soap would work well, but you have to be careful with any of those because you can take the bloom off your trees, that pretty coloring. So what I do, and you've heard me say it before, I carry a stick around mine, and I have a cane, and I'll just tap them, because once you've knocked them off, and if you tap them, they'll all drop down. They can't get up there again, and it's an easy, non-chemical way of controlling them. So pine sawflies have arrived. Go out and check your Scotch pine, primarily Mugos.
Perfect. Thanks, Fred. I can just see Fred with his cane. That's his
Wonderful.
excuse.
I have a holster. I have a rifle-like carrier on my tractor. Whack, whack, whack.
Okay, Lowell, on that note, what do we have?
Okay, I brought in something that I guess we're seeing it quite a bit in what used to be lawns last year. Last year was very difficult on turf, and in a number of areas we're seeing smooth brome grass, which is a perennial grass, as a weed in turf. It doesn't like to be mowed, and it's not very competitive in Kentucky bluegrass type of turf. But when all of that kind of dies away, this kind of really sticks out, and it is right now. It's a perennial cool season grass. One distinguishing characteristic on this is, maybe we can see this right here. Depending on where you're looking, there is almost a W or a M watermark on the leaf that's very distinctive of smooth brome grass. The unfortunate, for folks that have some of this in their turf, unfortunately, there's not really a selective way to remove it from a Kentucky bluegrass or fescue turf. So if you have it and want to get rid of it, you're probably looking at renovating that area and spraying the smooth brome with a pretty healthy dose of Roundup, and then kind of starting over in that area.
And most places don't allow horses in town, so that's the other option, because they love it. All right, Lauren, you have Beauty and the Beast there, I think.
All the good stuff. A lot of beautiful flowering crabapple trees out there right now. And I brought along just an example of a couple and some things to consider when we're talking about scab. Now, the trees are looking great this time of year, but come September, a lot of times they're losing a lot of leaves, particularly a lot of our older cultivars. You can see in here some fruit mummies. Here's one that we've got in here, and then some of the older fruit here. A lot of times that's where some of the inoculum for scab can come from. And then you can see we even have some infections on some of the leaves, starting where we've got those irregular edges and things where we start to see some scab infections. Now, the key is, if you want to try to manage this, it's really not too late. You're a little late, but a fungicide application would help keep those leaves or retain them later in the season so you wouldn't defoliate. But one of the main reasons I wanted to show this also was that if you're considering a new tree in your landscape, just keep in mind that scab is a very common disease in Nebraska. The trees will look great this time of year, but then a lot of times later lose their leaves. So just try to select a cultivar that has some resistance in it when you're establishing a new tree.
As opposed to your earlier solution of picking each mummy off hand by hand, right?
Well, yeah, if you're really bored, I guess you could do that, but it probably wouldn't make any difference.
Okay, so. Thanks, Lauren. Jeff, you have a couple of shrub options, I think.
I have a couple different shrub options, and you usually say, oh, you have beauty at that end. Unfortunately, they're wilting. I should have had them in water, so I cut these a couple hours ago, and I guess they've had it. So, but anyway, I'll talk about them anyway. This yellow one here is Carya japonica, and Carya is what I like about this plant is it has the nice green stems and these kind of happy, sunny flowers in the spring. And these flowers were actually really nice a little bit ago, but anyway, but it looks great this time of year. So it's one of those that does very well, and you can use it. It's one of these nice flowering shrubs that'll tolerate some shade, which is hard sometimes with really good flowering shrubs. So, and mine at home is about 4 foot tall, 4 foot wide, and it does really well. Hardly any care to it. Kind of takes care of itself. This other plant here is pearl bush or exocorda, and it's kind of an arching, rounded shrub. Again, in that 4 or 5 foot range, and it can get wider over time. And it's just starting to flower, as you can see, and it really becomes prolific. They're just covered in these white flowers. So, and these are two shrubs we don't talk a lot about. You don't see them a lot, and you can kind of call them old-fashioned shrubs, but they do really well in our part of the country anyway.
And they're kind of workhorses. They don't really need much care.
That's right.
I think the pearl bush is probably the bride, maybe.
Right. It's a seedling off of the bride.
Seedling off the bride.
Yeah.
So the bridezilla.
The bridezilla, right.
Or bridess, maybe. All right, Fred, you get the first question with images, and you had a little bit of a hint on that, so you not only have images, but you have the actual samples of what this question is, and this is viewers who want to know what to look for if they have iris and they're worried about iris borers.
And then we'll start with this picture. That's the adult, and it's nocturnal. It flies at night, and you will never see this. And the reason we sent in the pedestal on the image was because they are so unusual. And actually, I brought what that came from right here. So yeah, you wouldn't see it. Okay, so what we're seeing here is, iris borer, they overwinter as eggs on last year's leaves. And we get done with these images, I'll show you a couple of where they are on here. And the eggs hatch in the spring. And the borers are very tiny, and they go up, they crawl up onto the leaves, and they tunnel into the leaf. They are a borer. And as they do it, you get these little areas like this of wetted areas, and inside of that would be a little borer. All right. As the caterpillars grow, they move down, and ultimately, and there we go, move down and end up feeding in the rhizomes. Right. These are rhizomes, correct? Mm-hmm. And do extensive damage. As they feed, they're a large caterpillar. They're maybe 1.5 inches long, so it's a very large caterpillar. And as they feed, they open that up, so they introduce a number of rot organisms, so the whole thing becomes sort of a nasty, slimy, smelly mess. And it's very discouraging when you're transplanting your iris. So very quickly, I don't know if we can go back to me. Let me show you. Here's a typical damage from last year. Can we see? Yeah, you can look at it, just sort of chewed this entire rhizome up. And I'm just going to show you one leaf. This came from my own, and you can see the there it is.
Spots.
Yeah, we can sort of see the spots. And here would be where the eggs would be laid on the leaf. So in terms of control, if we're already at this stage where we have where they're already in there, we're going to need to use some sort of an insecticide, and something like orthene would work, or imidacloprid would work, or a number of different permethrin, applied to the leaves. And you want to do that right about now, when the iris leaves are about 4 to 6 inches in height. So that would be the time to treat.
Perfect.
Okay?
Thanks, Fred. So pay attention, iris lovers.
So now would be the time to be out there looking.
Perfect. All right, Lowell, you get a weed question, and this is one that you kind of raised your eyebrows on once we figured out what it is. But this viewer found big patches of this in kind of moist edges and shade in eastern Nebraska. They wonder what it is, and is it a weed?
That is a weed, and it's actually a very bad weed. It's called garlic mustard. It is a biennial in the brassica or mustard family, and it is highly invasive, particularly in shaded, wooded areas, and it can spread very, very quickly. And one of the reasons it's undesirable is because it will often choke out native plants or flowers in timber areas. And it's in other areas of the country, it's actually a noxious weed, and there's task force around it. So if people see that, they should make an effort to control that. They can spray it with 2 to 3% solution of Roundup or glyphosate in the spring when its foliage is full on it. But it's one that they should try and get rid of.
Okay, so keep your eye out for that, viewers, especially in the east.
Yep.
All right, Lauren, you had a question from a viewer who has been growing tomatoes in earth boxes, and seems as though every year she gets this problem. She throws away the bad ones, adds some calcium to the boxes, got new soil for the boxes last year, but she's wondering if she needs new soil again. How does she manage this?
Well, and what we're looking at here is blossom end rot, which is typically a nutrient issue. So the new soil that she's incorporating, I guess, would be a way to help that. I guess, and I'm going to ask Jeff to maybe contribute here on actual soil modification and pH if they wanted to change that in the container. That may be something that's a problem to have that.
Yeah, well, you're right. You could add some different additives to that if you need to add some sulfur to that container. If we need to bring the pH down a little bit, that's something we could add to it as well, and as fertility. So, we were talking earlier about modifying the temperatures with the containers, so insulating the inside of the containers, using a variety of things from, Kim was suggesting regular sheets of insulation to bubble wrap, something like that to help modify the temperature so they don't have big jumps.
And choose one that's less susceptible, which
Right.
is difficult sometimes. All right, Jeff, you also have an ID picture. This is a viewer who wonders about this particular flower, found this in southeast Missouri, and it is a bulb, blooming now, or actually about a week ago, and wonders what that is. Really was intrigued by this one.
Well, you and I talked about this quite a bit, and it looks to be Camassia, which is a native to the U.S. to the northwest U.S. in the Washington area. So, and it is very pretty, and there's several that are kind of in that group that they could look at and kind of follow that and trace that themselves and see what they think. But it looks like it's that part of the and it's unusual in that it's a native bulb, and we talked about using that around here a little bit more, just because it is kind of a cool bulb.
All right, you get the next pictures, Fred. And we've actually had several questions about these creatures this year. This is a Lincoln viewer, found them in the woodpile and wonders if they're the good, bad, or the ugly.
In the woodpile, they're no issue. That's a bandit ash borer. We've talked about red-headed ash borer and locust borer and some others. And what they are coming out from that wood. So that wood was probably harvested last year and stacked in the wood pile. And so now those adults are coming out and looking for trees. That's not really, so they're a non-issue at this point. Sometimes if people bring firewood down in their basements, they'll come out and come out into the house again. No issue. But again, borers are a serious pest of a lot of our hardwood trees, our shade trees. So, and we're just getting into time when we might want to be doing borer treatments. So you might want to be thinking about that. But that's a bandit ash borer, no problem coming out of the woodpile.
Cool, thanks, Fred. All right, Lowell, you have a couple of sets of pictures in your next couple rounds, and they are the invasion of things like barnyard grass, potentially, or that's what they think it is. From a Wilbur viewer, I believe this one is.
Yep.
They want to know how to kill it or how they can overseed with something that looks like it, so their lawn looks a little more uniform.
So I was looking at this picture earlier, and Unfortunately, I think that is smooth brome that I talked about just a little bit earlier. And they can, if they want to verify that, look at that leaf, give it a little time before, or don't mow it off, to try to look for that W watermark on there to verify that. And if it is smooth brome, if it's really thick in an area, like I mentioned earlier, there's not really a selective way to take it out of a turf. So they're probably going to want to basically renovate that area if they truly want to get rid of it.
All right, thanks. Lauren, your favorite tree question. Yet another peach. People love their peaches, and it's not been a great year. This is a viewer who actually said that this particular peach had very wet areas around where you're kind of seeing the sort of the debris. There are a handful of flowers. The tree is 20 years old already, and they're wondering, again, we talked about this off air, is this a canker? What is this exactly before it gets thrown to other people?
This is a situation where you have really a really weak tree, and I think it probably started many years back from some of those first pruning cuts that you see on there that look like they were, really level with the surface of the bark and maybe done too deep to start some wounding events. And then after that, you have a lot of cankers and things that will move in, and then that tree's stressed, and it may have borers or anything else. I mean, could come in at that point because you just have so much injury. So unfortunately, I would really recommend on this one that you enjoy the fruit that you can as long as you want, but the tree's going to die fairly soon. And if there's much mass to that above that, and it's going to fall on anything, then it's a hazard tree. So just be careful. If you really like peaches, I'd plant another one. It's an opportunity for a new cultivar, maybe a good cold tolerant one next to it, and get ready to stage that one up.
Right, and 20 years again is kind of a long time.
That's a long time for a peach.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Jeff, you also have an image, and this is a viewer that says, what is this exactly? In their landscape, in their lawn, in their garden beds. They want to know what it is, and of course the follow-up is how to get rid of it.
Well, it looks like it's chives, and so they don't necessarily need to get rid of it. If they want to enjoy it in their salads and in their food, we have it at home. We'll cut it and freeze it and save it for a dreary day when you need to freshen something up. So they don't necessarily need to get rid of it, but Lowell, what do you think? If they wanted to get rid of it, if they really don't want any more chives.
If they really don't want it, it's very difficult if you use a herbicide to control it because the leaves they're kind of upright and they're kind of waxy, and it's very difficult to get herbicide onto those leaves. Using like a 2,4-D plus glyphosate mixture, maybe even consider mowing it first and then applying to the tops of that. Sure. And it's a perennial, so repeat applications are important.
Or dig it up.
Or dig it up.
Or freeze it, and don't let it go to seed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Spring chives on cottage cheese.
There you go. Always good advice. All right, Fred, you have a question that we had kind of a fun conversation about. We don't know where this viewer is from, but she planted a hardy banana.
Oh, yes.
And she had previously saved it over from the past summer. She was working up the soil, and she noticed half a dozen of what she describes as thick, juicy grubs. She wonders about whether they will attack the banana root system. Should she apply something to the soil? What should she do about that?
If those are annual white grubs, they aren't going to be feeding anymore right now anyway, so I wouldn't worry about them. But most grubs actually feed on organic matter. So if you're doing a little digging and you're doing any moving of that plant, you might want to look and see if there's any root pruning. Because that would be suggest that there might be a problem, and as long as you aren't harvesting and using the fruit from this, you could use something like merit, imidacloprid, applied around the base as a drench, and that should take care of the grubs quite nicely. Probably not though until probably mid-July, or June to July, because that's when the grubs would actually be there. But I wouldn't worry about it unless you start seeing damage in the banana plant itself.
Okay. Every time I hear the word juicy associated with grubs,
Yes.
I think of the pat of butter made out of a grub in Swiss
Well,
Family Robinson.
In the
Ugh.
turf business, we call them land shrimp, right?
Oh, yuck. All right. So, Lowell, your question is actually from a Dorchester viewer, and it has a great application to our chive conversation.
Okay.
This is a viewer that has what she has described as wild onion or garlic
Yeah.
coming up in the lawn
Yeah.
for at least 15 years. She's tried Roundup, cut it off. Is it hopeless?
Yeah, so what Jeff and I talked about on the chives kind of applies to wild onion or wild garlic. It's one of those, very vertical growth. It's very difficult to get good coverage with a herbicide on that. And it is a pretty hardy perennial. And one herbicide application isn't going to really take care of it. Repeat applications are important. And if that doesn't work, culturally they can always dig them out, but a lot of times it spreads to the point where that's really not a viable option. So just being persistent, and one thing I always get people to think about is if they apply a herbicide, make sure you have the right rate or dose and you're not underdosing on that.
All right, thanks. All right, Lauren, this is a viewer from O'Neill. They have an awful lot of red cedar that have suffered, and they're talking shelter belts, suffered in the fall and the winter from either drought or disease, well-established windbreaks, and they're saying they're dying in odd places. So their question is whether there are diseases that are attacking as well as the drought, or what is it?
Well, in particular, this last year, if it was just noticed in this last year, I tend to think there's a good chance that we were looking at winter desiccation. Now, if it's something that they've noticed over a sequence of, the last several years, and the inside or lower portion of the tree is dying and it's on its way up, a common disease we see is Cercospora needle blight in our cedars. So I would just encourage them to really think about when they observed it, and the progression, and then they may want to take a sample into the local extension office or something.
All right. Jeff, this is a viewer who is asking about their lilacs. The shrub does not bloom. It hasn't flowered in years. They're wondering is it too old, grows flowers or leaves and they're healthy but no flowers. She does say she has cut it back several times thinking that would help it flower.
Okay.
Is that a pruning question or an age question or both?
Well, if she's cut it back, and so if that's happened in the last couple of years, I'd say that they probably don't need to cut it anymore for a while. I'd give it a few years to recover from being cut back or rejuvenated. And then once that's occurred, give it another year or two, and then start looking at that cane removal, picking out a couple of the big canes, removing that, and getting into that sort of cycle that each year you take out a couple large canes.
All right, Fred, you have a picture from a viewer who thinks this is a flower on their ash, and it's a white ash, and then we have talked about the brown things hanging in the ash that.
You have some.
Yeah. So what do they do here?
Those are flowers. Those are
Okay.
male flowers
Okay.
on green ash. And what happens is there's a tiny mite called it's an areophyid mite, and it goes in and lays its eggs and then develops within those male flowers. And what we get is these growths, these sort of growthy growths. And I actually have some right here that I got right here on campus. Right outside our building. And so this is called ash flower gall. And these are from the male flowers, so they're of no concern other than aesthetics for the tree. They're kind of ugly up there. I consider it all part of nature's wondrous pageantry, right? So I think they're pretty cool. But
Well, and the flowers are beautiful,
Yeah.
so it's just one of those things.
Yeah,
But
it's just-
indeed, what's green then turns brown.
and it doesn't cause any harm to the tree.
All right, thanks, Fred. All right, you have yet another taking over my lawn question.
Okay.
And this is apparently a Kentucky blue on very sandy soil in the Norfolk area.
Yeah.
Any idea what this is and what to
Wow.
do there?
I think this is Broom night. I think. I think that's what that is. There's a chance it could be Bermuda grass as well. Bermuda grass will have clasping oracles on it. If it's brome, look for that W or M watermark on the leaf. And unfortunately, if it's either one of those, they're both cool season perennial grasses in a perennial grass, and there's not a selective way to remove that. So just complete renovation of that area is the only viable way to really get rid of it.
Sounds to me like all the turf specialists ought to be breeding a lawn quality brome grass.
Be good this
Yeah,
year.
maybe. Okay. All right. Lauren, you have an image of somebody who had hollyhocks with issues last year. This is in Underwood, Iowa, and they really want to avoid these issues this
is
year.
pretty
What do they
good.
need? What do they need to? They want to know what it is, and then how do they not get it this year?
Well, I think that's just beautiful. That is hollyhock rust, and it'll form those orange spots on the top, and then on the underside of the leaf, it'll be kind of a dark brown. It is something that you can easily control with a fungicide application. So if you can remember about the time that you had that occur last year, it will many times overwinter in that location. So, probably once you start getting significant canopy, you could use a foliar fungicide with the rust, the mycobutanil products, the propiconazole products, both of those would be good.
All right. And I think last year there were actually more than one infestation of that rust.
Well,
or
it
else
repeats.
it would.
It actually, once it infects, it keeps going. So it's not like cedar apple rust where you just have a month-long window. It keeps infecting once it starts.
Gotcha.
So.
Perfect. All right, Jeff, this is a viewer who actually found us from Michigan.
Oh,
But it's a question that is applicable because we have the same plant.
okay.
This is a dwarf Korean lilac on standard, which is the
Okay.
graft. Hers is about 13 years old. She's afraid it is beginning to die or have something wrong with it in the center. She did put some stakes in the soil, some fertilizer stakes in the soil to try to help it. Any hope?
Well, I guess so people know, if they're not familiar with that term standard, essentially they're making a tree out of a shrub. So they're pruning it up high so it has a stem like a tree. And then you have this lovely dwarf Korean lilac up high, 3 feet, 2 feet off the ground. So it looks like it's a flowering tree.
Right.
And again, we talk about cutting lilacs back and pruning and doing some of that stuff. And something like this would make it difficult to do that without really changing the look of the plant. And that's probably what's happened in this case. It's a mature plant. It really hasn't had that sort of pruning. And I think probably it's served its time and it's ready to try something else at this stage.
Right. It does seem like a lot of those things grafted on those standards, their lifespan is a bit shortened.
Yeah, and it makes sense that we just can't treat them the way they should be. So.
Right, exactly. All right, Fred, you get a question from a viewer who has, they're not sure if this is on maple or not, but they found these things in their yard on that twig, and they wonder, what is it? It looks like cotton.
Yeah, those, it looks to me like it's on apple.
Yeah,
And
kinda does, doesn't it?
when I looked at that, it looked to me like a woolly apple aphid. They're very, very common and pretty key back east where in Michigan and California where there's a lot more apple. Interesting, they have an alternate host on elm. So, they're the most abundant where there's apple and elm together. So it's a kind of a bizarre kind of life cycle. They don't have to spend that time on elm. So unless they're very, very abundant, I would ignore them. They aren't going to cause a lot of injury. If there's a lot of them, you could control them with any of the malathion or any of the fruit sprays.
Or flick. if
Yeah,
there aren't very
you could
many.
flick them. That'd be one to
Flick.
tap off too.
Flick or tap.
And
Okay. All right, thanks.
flick or tap.
Thanks, Fred. All right, Lowell, this is a viewer who wonders, they sent us an image, a beautiful image. We were talking off camera. It's so close up, you can't really get a sense of scale. And I think we've talked about this before, but you found some.
Yeah, so what the viewer sent in there is a picture of one of the speed wells, probably field speed well. That's probably what it is. Winter annual, and I brought in a plant here this evening, and winter annuals are going to seed right now, very quickly. And if you picked up that plant and looked on the bottom side of that, you would see all the seed pods like you're seeing right here on that. Once again, best management time for this is in the fall. 2,4-D or dicamba application in the fall will do an excellent job on that. Applications right now will actually probably hasten seed development on the plant, and they can't really do anything to stop seed development, so it'll be there next year on that. And one other thing, on the previous question I had, I said Bermuda grass. I should have said quack grass.
Quack,
on that.
as opposed
Clasping
to.
oracles.
All right, as opposed to Bermuda.
Yes.
All right, thanks for that clarification. All right, Lauren, this is a viewer who has a question about a particular variety of sweet potato called Raven, which looks like one of the the black ornamental ones. They've used it in landscape beds as well as in raised beds, along with other varieties, and this seems to be the only one that gets this sort of, they don't know if it's a disease or window painting or insect damage. It sounds like perhaps the soil is a little wet as well. You want to comment a little bit on those sweet potato things?
Well, and if you look at it, you can see those white patches on the leaves while the leaf is still up there. Usually symptoms like that, when I see it, it's some sort of a burn. So, either maybe it was not in, a lot of intense light and it was put into full sun, or possibly frosted with the weather patterns that we've had. One of those two things is what I really think that is. It doesn't really look like a disease to me, so I wouldn't be too worried about that.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Jeff, you get the final image for the evening, and this is a viewer who had two 25-foot tall red sunset maples spaded in fall of 2011. They've never really performed well. The leaves start to shrivel up. They are seeing these problems on the trunk now. They're trying to manage the watering, but they're seeing the bark become brittle and peel off. They're wondering what sort of advice we could give to them. So there's the bitty leaves.
Okay. Well, 25-foot tall maples spaded in are enormous trees. And assuming that the tree spade was a 92-inch spade, which again is a gigantic truck with a huge spade on it. You think it's 92 inches across and 92 inches deep, the size of that tree spade. So that's a big hole in the ground. So if they were spaded in at the right size, what appears to me is that there was some root death. And so there was on one side, or a couple of the other images showed some other large dead spots. And my guess is a root was killed and probably moisture wasn't maintained at the right level. They should have large mulch beds for those trees. So that's why we typically recommend a 2-inch, 3-inch at the most balled and burlap tree. They're just easier to care for, and they're going to get big fast, especially a red sunset will grow pretty quickly. So.
Right. And we have a question from North Platte, who said they are digging in a flower bed and finding a great abundance of grubs. Thought the severe conditions of last season would reduce the population.
No, grubs are pretty tough, and they can extract water from in low water conditions. They just move up and down the soil profile. Again, for the most part, I wouldn't be too concerned. But if they are very large, say the size of a quarter, when they're all rolled up, you might want to consider putting down something like imidacloprid, merit into that ornamental bed to control them, because they may be feeding for most of the summer.
All right, thanks, Fred. Lowell, this is a Utica viewer who wants to know how to get rid of horseradish plants. It's a severe problem all over the yard. They've tried Roundup, and what would work? You think it's horseradish or dock, maybe? Maybe it's horseradish.
Yeah, I don't think of horseradish as a problem plant. I probably want to see a picture of that before I said anything on that.
All right.
But it's dock.
Thanks.
Curly dock.
All right. We have a handful of seconds left, and we have a question about giant black things in crab apples and in plums, and I think we
Okay.
probably have a picture next week. What is that, Lauren?
Giant black things in plums are going to be black knot that needs to be cut out. And I just want to take this opportunity to show everybody my official mushroom collecting basket that tomorrow our producer and I are going to take a little mushroom collecting foray. And we'll have that video hopefully next week. We'll see what we collect, and then we'll have some really great images of morels is what we're hoping for. So I want to encourage everybody to tune in next week and see what happens.